you ever gotten like a new hot sauce or condiment that you really like and you decide to start experimenting by putting it on pretty much everything that could be eaten? Amongst the white people of the Midwest, there's this food-like product called ranch dressing that gets put on pretty much everything. You put it on pizza, you put it on breadsticks, you put it in casseroles, cinnamon buns. If it can be eaten, a white Midwesterner has probably dipped it in ranch. But it doesn't work on everything. Now, as is the case with trying to use a hammer to fix pottery or drinking bleach for medicinal properties that don't exist, putting ranch on everything will only work some of the time. Now, I'm not a ranch purist, I'm not an anti-rancher, but I'm also not a Midwesterner, at least not in my being. Though I have lived here for quite a while, I am thoroughly a Boricua from the East Coast. But you can use ranch within reason, I'm sure of it. The same could be said for utilitarianism. See, utilitarianism's origins are similar to that of ranch dressing amongst the potluck classes of the Midwest. It gets thrown in just about everything and really doesn't work all of the time. But when it does work, it poses some really interesting questions for us. Now, in this video, we're going to talk about the context surrounding the creation of utilitarianism as an ethical philosophy, and then in the following section, we're going to jump into Mill's argument from Utilitarianism Chapter 2 in order to understand the nuts and bolts of what he's trying to say about this ethical philosophy. And then finally, I'll include some criticisms of utilitarianism that have been made throughout the years, largely popular ones that might spring to mind immediately. Now, as expected, I'll have section markers for each one of these so you can scroll through and find it. I'm still trying to figure out the whole chapter markers thing, and I will try and get that for you. But basically, if you're looking for something specific, you'll be able to identify it very, very quickly. So, without further ado, consider this the prequel to Mill's version of utilitarianism. Now, before Mill was a guy named Jeremy Bentham, and Bentham came up with the principle of utility. That is, that one should do the most good for the most number of people. One should maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Bentham used this primarily within the context of making laws. He would write up drafts of constitutions for emerging nations, and he would try to get them to found their nations on utilitarian legal principles. And as you can see from reading about utilitarianism in the book of the same name, it really does seem to begin as a way of talking about large groups of people having to figure out how they're going to organize themselves together in an ethical way. Bentham's version of utilitarianism doesn't begin with the question of how we might determine who is responsible for what or what the right thing to do for an individual might be. Instead, he begins with how do we construct an entire society on the basis of good laws. Bentham decided that what was needed was some kind of lowest common denominator between all human beings in order to figure out what kinds of pleasures and pains, goods and harms a given society might have. And this sounds great in general, right? Let's figure out what we all share in common, and then we'll build our society off of those commonalities. But when you get into the details, it gets weird. See, Bentham believed that you could figure out the basic unit of happiness. And he did just this. He said, okay, I can figure out a way to quantify how happy someone is He called this unit a hedon, and he developed what he called a hedonistic calculus, which was his way of saying, I can run the numbers and figure out the cost-benefit analysis of whether or not any person should take any particular action. I can literally provide a kind of mathematical equation of happiness for people to determine whether or not they should, choose to turn left or to turn right. Bentham's form of utilitarianism, which I'll use synonymously with quantitative utilitarianism, is relatively easy to criticize for a number of reasons. First, the hedonistic calculus assumes way too many similarities amongst people, and the emphasis is on assumption. It emphasizes what Bentham believed was most common amongst all people, and as a result, it really creates a very shallow idea of what people have in common. So, for example, we might say that access to drinking water, to potable drinking water, is something that all people should share in common, right? Access to it. But if we think in the United States about something like the Flint water crisis, where access was not the problem, it was the quality of the water and the long-term effects that drinking that water had, and that the decision to make sure that access to that water remained the case even after it was discovered that this water is bad, we might question whether or not Bentham is on the right track. This also leads us to the second sort of classic criticism, which is that particular groups, historically disadvantaged groups, historically excluded groups, historically minoritized or oppressed groups, tend to get the short end of the stick when it comes to Bentham's idea of utilitarianism, because they have a particular history that is not taken into account when you're trying to do Bentham-style utilitarianism. In the end, you basically reduce everything down to that lowest common denominator, and you disregard history, you disregard a set of social circumstances that put people in a very bad place. Right? You disregard the history of colonization. You disregard the history of land being stolen and people being oppressed, of enslavement. And instead you say, hey, everybody should be able to have an equal opportunity to a job. And that sounds great, but it's not taking into account the way that different people are starting from different places. And this is something that Mill kind of addresses, but kind of doesn't. For Mill, Bentham's principle of utility was exactly right. The problem was that it took Mill a while to get there. See, Mill was something of a child prodigy, and he had all of this pressure heaped on him, and so people expected great things from him. He went to college when he was really, really young, and he was put into all of these hard classes because everybody's like, man, this kid's so smart, and he's great, and he's gonna change everything, and he has a nervous breakdown. And when he is able to recover and do the kind of work that he needs to do to make sure that he can manage his life and manage his expectations and other people's expectations of him, he comes to value that principle of utility, but says Bentham's approach is too broad, too calculating, and doesn't take into account the way that pleasure can be different for different people. But it also doesn't take into account differences among pleasures. And so Mill develops what he calls the greatest happiness principle. Namely, that any action is good if it produces the most amount of happiness and the least amount of pain for the most amount of people. An action is right if it produces happiness. and if it minimizes the pain it takes to produce that happiness. And the end result is that Mill is focused on actions that will have a consequence which produces happiness. See, Mill and Bentham are what we would call consequentialist ethical thinkers. They're less concerned with how we get to happiness than that what we do produces happiness. They're less concerned that our intentions are good and more concerned with the consequences of our actions. Now, it's important to note that Mill adds something unique here to the way that he formulates the principle of utility or the greatest happiness principle. Actions are right if they promote happiness. Okay, we can get on board with this. They are right if they end in happiness. If the end result is happiness, if the consequence is happiness, it's good. But that doesn't mean that all pleasures are the same. It doesn't mean that all kinds of happiness are the same. Because with Mill's utilitarianism, there are different qualities of happiness that one has to think about. So this is where he's taking this idea of the greatest happiness and expanding on it. Now, it might be the case that the greatest happiness for the lowest common denominator, for the largest number of people, is good, but it could also be the bare minimum and not actually address the issues that are needed to be addressed in order to produce happiness. So there might be a different quality of happiness, a different quality of pleasure that needs to be addressed in order for one to fulfill the principle of utility or the greatest happiness principle. So why are we talking about qualitatively different pleasures? Because the bare minimum for everybody might still not be that ethical. In fact, it might be the case that there are some pleasures that people ought to pursue, even if it seems like they produce a lot more pain than other types of pleasures. So, for example, eating a donut seems to be a very simple pleasure that you can have. And that's fine. It's a simple pleasure. Donuts taste good. A lot of people eat donuts, right? They make gluten-free donuts if you can't metabolize gluten or that sort of a thing. But it's just eating a donut. Understanding how to cook a really good meal and how flavors pair together, and knowing that these different ingredients are not only going to produce smells that are incredible, it's going to look really good, it's going to taste amazing, and it's going to have all different kinds of nutritional value far beyond that of a donut, seems like a lot more work than just getting a donut. But Mill would argue all of that amounts to a much greater pleasure. And if you get like one level of that, like this food doesn't look good but it tastes amazing and is very nutritious, or this food smells incredible and it looks great, it's maybe not as good for you, but it's still hitting at least a couple of those marks. It is going to be a better quality of pleasure. And that difference is important because as Mill goes on in the argument, qualitatively higher pleasures are going to be worth pursuing even if we don't attain them, rather than low-level pleasures that we can sort of basically attain. Mill then makes an addendum to this claim, saying that when we engage in the pursuit of these pleasures, there's high risk and high reward. The more we pursue these pleasures, the more likely it is that we are going to fail. But it is better to pursue these things that are higher and more difficult than it is to just meet the most basic and bare level of needs. Which, if you pause and you think about it, seems kind of wrong. Why would you pursue these higher pleasures and be unfulfilled rather than meeting basic needs. See, Mill argues that these lower level pleasures are easy to satisfy. And the problem is that satisfying these low level pleasures isn't necessarily going to be better in the long run for everybody. Satisfying the pleasure of not doing your homework and playing a video game might seem in the short term to be a very easy thing to satisfy and you feel good. But in the long run, it might be the case that what you did in your homework provided you with practice in a skill that will be really important later on in your life, and you'll be really happy that you focused on that. Like reading in your ethics class, because that helps you think better about being a good person. I don't know, I'm just trying to tell you to read. You need to read. Then we get to the infamous quote that Mill has in this chapter, which is, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Because for the fool and the pig, if they're of a different opinion, it is because they only know their side of the question." Now, Mill's statement is a doozy, and it's worth unpacking a bit, because he's saying that it is better to be a person who is dissatisfied, who does not achieve these higher pleasures, than it is to be a person who achieves low-level pleasures. Mill is quick to say that when people argue that it's better to just be satisfied with low-level pleasures, it's not really their fault. They only know that fulfillment. They don't know all of the benefit that can come from higher pleasures unfulfilled. So let's sit with this a bit, because Mill is saying something very important about the difference between these two qualities of pleasure. Everybody has the capacity for higher pleasures, but that can be disrupted rather quickly, largely due to biology or social circumstances or a casualty of where and when and amongst whom you were born, right? The ability to cultivate these higher pleasures is itself kind of held hostage by the existential circumstances in which you find yourself. And this is where Mill's qualitative utilitarianism connects with the animating impulse behind utilitarianism in general. In order to seek the highest pleasures, one must create a society in which citizens are provided with the means by which they can pursue these pleasures. If your goal is mental cultivation, then you need to create an equitable education system that can provide the kind of structure and support and care and education for students to learn. If you are not meeting all of those needs, if you're not providing an environment that allows for self-cultivation, then you're not promoting happiness. And you are not in alignment with the principle of utility. This is in part why Mill believes that decisions about morality need to be as impartial as possible. When we have to choose between our own happiness and the happiness of others, utilitarianism requires that in making that choice, we have to remove ourselves from the equation. Will removing my happiness be in the long run something that contributes to a whole lot of disastrous consequences that reduce the amount of pleasure for everybody? Or will it be the case that choosing to fulfill the greater number of people's happiness in that moment ends up in the long run producing even more happiness, even more pleasure? In other words, we have to try to make as impartial a choice as possible. But is that really possible? And does that leave open a lot of stuff as ethically justifiable? Now, Mill seems to tip his hat here, saying that in the later stages of the argument, right action is not indicative of virtuous character. Bad people can do all kinds of things. Darth Vader might hold the door open for someone. Voldemort might help you carry your groceries to your car. And Thanos probably will give you flowers to give to your mom. But also, all of them kind of did a genocide. Who cares what kindness there is to them? Show me your receipts. Cars are bad, actually. Now, this title is provocative, and it's provocative for a reason. People assume, at least in the United States, we tend to assume the ubiquity of cars. You drive everywhere. For a huge amount of people, cars are simply part of the landscape. And a car, in and of itself, doesn't seem to be inherently bad. A car gives you social mobility. A car gives you geographical mobility. A car helps you carry things you can't carry on your own from one place to another. But the problem isn't cars. It's that cars are not just cars. Cars are gasoline, and they are roads, and they are accidents, and they are insurance, and they are trucks, and they are new models, and they are more expenses, and they are sitting on the highway, idling, waiting for traffic to subside, pumping the air full of carbon emissions. Cars are not just cars. Cars are all of their consequences. And so when we start to think about all of these issues related to cars, we have to weigh whether or not they produce a greater amount of happiness. But the challenge is that who gets to say that environmental stability is a higher pleasure than freedom of mobility? The problem is, for the majority of people, to do the things that they need to do in order to be happy, they need a car. And thus we build a world around using the car to do that. We don't build a world around buses or boats or trains. We build it around cars. On the one hand, it seems like the symbol of freedom. But on the other hand, it's a symbol of a kind of selfish disregard of the consequences of that vehicle. There's always a consequence, a trade-off. And this is ultimately, I think, what's at the core of the problem with utilitarianism. Who is determining the trade-off? Have people determined that the very idea of geographical mobility means more than a world that is less impacted by greenhouse gases, by chemical runoff on roads, by cutting into large swaths of land in order to create an environment that works better for cars? Again, the problem is not the individual cars or the idea of the car. It is that there are a whole bunch of other consequences that we are deeming less desirable or not even as harmful as they might be, because certain types of pleasure get elevated. And this is one of the key criticisms, I think, of utilitarianism, that it assumes itself to be a universal ethic while being deeply culturally situated. Utilitarianism's problem with being able to address cultural uniqueness, along with some of the problems that Bentham's version of utilitarianism is not able to get over, and that Mill kind of inherits and is not able to get over as well. Namely, being unable to really provide a reasoning for why protected groups being protected is a higher social pleasure than general social pleasure and general social happiness, because the very logic of utilitarianism doesn't really allow for it. There are more contemporary utilitarians who are probably going to have a lot more nuance on that, but it's something to think about that Mill's version of utilitarianism believes that there is a kind of laundry list of higher pleasures, of higher quality happiness that we ought to try to achieve, but can't really account for that within the context of cultural location and cultural situatedness. Sounds like something he might try to address in Chapter 5, don't you think? Anyway, enjoy your reading. Adios.